of these examples we buy. We get it. We have no problem believing them. But the question that lingers is, can a black African country with a black African government get there? Because I don't see that on your graph. And for that, I'd like to spend a little bit of time, a little bit of a digression. Now, forgive me for doing this, but you'll find that this is probably just a reflection of my own social circle. This question, when I discuss it amongst people who are black, whenever they see just something that's been written in the paper, they go, in Zulu or Sesotho or something, what do you expect from a black person? The nice thing about black people in this sense is that they feel free. I'm not sure that they should be, but they feel free to overtly share the racist view to everyone in public. My social circle, people who are not black by race, don't have the same freedom. I've never heard them express the same sentiment. But it makes sense to me that if black colleagues, black friends express the sentiment, it must be a lingering question in those races as well. I mean, is this even possible? Now, I'd like you to imagine, if you will, the Great Wall of China. Has everyone seen a visual of it? Anybody not seen a visual of it here? Okay. 8,000 kilometers of this incredibly wide wall, something that is architectural marvel the world over. This is something that's visited and is on the bucket list of almost all travelers in the world. It is a magnificent piece of architecture. However, what's very interesting to me is that if we go to West Africa, there's a small architectural monument, and it's called the Great City of Benin. Has anybody been? It's a very interesting, very, very interesting monument. And if I had the visuals, it would paint the picture, but I would like instead to default to the description that was given by a very eminent person. You'll see that I'll default to the specialist in this area because I don't want to be accused of distorting the truth. This particular specialist is a scientist by the name of Fred Pearce, and he writes for The New Scientist. He writes, and I'm going to prepare a reading that's incredibly tiny, but I'd like you to listen to his words because they'll paint a better picture than I can with his words. He's talking about the walls of the great city of Benin, and I quote, "They extend for some 16,000 kilometers in all, a mosaic of more than 500 interconnected settlement boundaries. They cover 6,500 square kilometers and were all dug by the Idu people. In all, they are 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China and consumed 100 times more material than the Great Pyramid of Cheops. They took an estimated 150 million hours of digging to construct, and they are perhaps the largest single archaeological phenomenon on the planet." Who had heard of this largest single archaeological phenomenon on the planet before this morning? Anyone? This is a very curious state of affairs. We are alleged that we can see the Great Wall of China from the moon, but something that would be 4 times the size is something that has escaped mention in the world of big data, the internet, Google, Google Earth, Google Maps, SpaceX. We can return rockets and reuse them, and yet we don't know that there is an archaeological phenomenon on this continent 4 times the size of the Great Wall of China. Let's move on a little and stay in West Africa. Has anybody heard of Mansa Musa? He was a Malayan emperor. He ruled from around 1320 to 1337. He comes to continental prominence when he decides, being the Muslim that he is, to take his pilgrimage. He embarks on a Hajj. When he does so, he takes 60,000 people with him in his entourage. 12,000 of them were slaves who had the sole purpose of carrying gold, wielding gold staffs, handling bags and horses. Amongst his party, there were 48,000 others, and 80 camels laden with between 36 and 120 kilograms of gold dust. His 2-year journey is recorded by a multitude of eyewitnesses. Apparently, Mansa Musa was a generous guy. He gave out so much gold on his trip to and from Mecca that it completely collapsed the value of gold in the region for a decade. Never in history has anybody been recorded as being single-handedly able to influence the price of gold. A similar and curious event, because nobody knows much about him. There are so many of these examples, and the reason why it's so difficult for me to summarize the provocations that I have for you this morning is because there are so many examples about the Aksumite naval power that were in the north of Ethiopia. I'm not sure how much you know about the Moors, but the Moors were people from the Maghreb who decided that in 711 they were going to embark on a conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. In all, they conquer much more than half of the Iberian Peninsula. And from 711 until 1492, they are the rulers of the Spanish and Portuguese worlds. In addition to which, they bring with them a number of inventions. They introduce paper to Europe, taking out a very clumsy system. The Muslim outlook had been such that literacy was encouraged for everyone from a very young age. And instead, at the time, the Christian outlook had reserved literacy and learning for a very small clerical class. All of these inventions, there are descriptions of the city of Cordoba under Moorish law, the first city to have street lights, and a whole range of inventions which we don't have time to get into today. The point I'm making is a very simple one. For the people of this African continent, we have been sold the disturbance in the story as the story. Whatever and however we see the problems of colonialism, of slavery, of apartheid, of genocide, of ethnic wars, and any other things, we have been tricked into believing that that is the totality of the African story, when in practice, it is a small disturbance. A disturbance that I'm happy to argue with those of you who are historical is much smaller than the disturbances of other regions. We can talk about the 1,000 years that Europe suffered under an unending series of conflicts. The story that we've chosen to focus on is so minuscule, is such a small disturbance, that it is still a crying shame. I raise this historical digression to make this fundamental point. The question of black governance and black economic prosperity and its ability to operate at the summit of global prosperity, intellect, and influence is not a question we need to answer today, because that has been settled for at least a millennia. A 50-year disturbance has never, and will never cancel it out. The only question that this raises is the Africans in this room. How long are we going to wait to return to the summit of global influence and economic affairs?